In this section, we will be covering the roots of sexual violence. This includes how it came through history, different aspects that have supported sexual violence, and those which opposed it. This is a bit of a longer section, so please take your time. Here's a quick overview of what we will be going over in this presentation. Define oppression and privilege, working assumptions, sexual violence as a tool of oppression, and historical trauma. What is oppression? The systematic and institutionalized mistreatment of one group of people by another group of people based on historical and current structures in society. This is when people are excluded from resources, benefits, and/or opportunities in society. This does not mean that there are people from marginalized groups who don't become successful, but we'll talk more about that later. Oppression is complex. There are multiple forms of oppression and each operates differently, but all of them operate at institutional levels in addition to individual levels. So what is privilege then? A person with privilege has special immunities, rights, or benefits enjoyed by groups of people that person falls in. These groups can be based on gender, race, sexuality, financial status, and more. The economic, social, and psychological validations and rewards are enjoyed by people or groups conforming to the values of a prejudiced society. Working assumptions. What does that even mean? A working assumption is similar to a common belief. Some working assumptions are: oppression hurts everyone but in different ways, all prejudices were taught to us, and it is not the fault of those who have benefited from the system of oppression. However, those who do benefit must accept responsibility for our role in oppression's continued existence. The experience of those targeted by oppression is very different from those who have benefited from it. But oppression keeps us separated and fearful of each other. No matter what type of family we came from, we were still taught prejudices in the larger culture. The system of oppression was in place before we were born. Learning about having advantages over others can be a major shocker and guilt instiller because we have been taught to believe in the American dream. It is a level playing field, you just have to work hard, and you will get ahead. But this isn't the case. However, feeling guilty often keeps people from addressing oppression because the emotion is too great. More working assumptions are that there is no hierarchy of oppression. All of us have had the experience of being targeted. Each individual's knowledge of privilege and oppression is different, and people come from a place of good intentions. However, that doesn't negate pain of emotion. Oppression operates in different ways depending on the category. Trying to rank one group's pain over another distracts us and prevents us from dismantling any and all oppression. This does not negate the fact that some people are more disadvantaged than others, especially when someone has multiple identities that are oppressed. Audre Lorde, a woman of color and a lesbian, wrote that there is no hierarchy of oppression. When it comes to working assumptions, we must work to eliminate all forms of oppression. Also, working to eliminate oppression is a lifelong process. It's not easy or quick. If it were, it wouldn't exist anymore. Sexual violence is a tool of oppression, but how is sexual violence used to oppress people? It's a tool of war. The violence can cause shame and lead to silence and stop the victims from speaking up against the offenders. It may also cause the victims to live in fear and prevent them from standing up for themselves. Sexual violence can also be used as a punishment to restrict activities. It leads to low self-worth and reduced or inhibited access to personal power and social resources. It keeps people in their place. So here's an important question you need to stop and answer. How is sexual violence similar to oppression? Now I will explain more on how sexual violence is a tool of oppression. What is the basis of sexual violence? Power and control. Now, what is the basis of oppression? Maintaining power and control. Here are a few examples of how sexual violence and oppression are connected. Both include words as weapon. The power. It's part of the fabric of our society. There are links to mythology, and sometimes it's used to silence certain groups or people. Words as weapons in sexual violence and oppression. We, in general, use words to express ourselves, our feelings, our thoughts. Offenders also use words to put victims, quote unquote, in their place, so to say. The language is grounded with a common purpose, to degrade, dehumanize, and make the violence more acceptable. Every type of oppression relies on hateful words and stereotypes. Women are called a multitude of vile names. Words may also be oppressive in unintentional ways, because those with privilege may be unaware of the impact certain words have. When working with victims and survivors, we need to be aware of the words we use. The path of oppression. Oppression didn't just appear out of thin air. It was created. It starts with stereotypes, which are thoughts based on fixed images and assumptions of characteristics belonging to a whole set of people. These progress into prejudice, or feelings that come from those thoughts of stereotypes. Prejudice then can cause discrimination, which are actions that stem from and are based on the prejudice. These all lead to oppression. It is institutionalized societal policies that limit a whole set of people and normalize and reinforce our stereotypes, prejudice, and justify the discrimination. How is power a tool in sexual violence and oppression? Well, sexual violence through coercion, threats, and violence causes women to feel intimidated, frightened, and helpless. It makes them think twice about where they'll go and who they'll trust. It gives power to the oppressor and takes it from the victim or survivor. Also, oppression narrows people's world and limits their freedom. They don't necessarily know what else is out there. A person of color may fear a traffic stop, have to deal with store clerks following them around. An LGBTQ person may have to deal with stares while using the bathroom and the threat or possibility of violence. These acts may seem minor if you've never experienced them, but they add up to a big impact on a person's existence in the world. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and go to history and how it has an impact on sexual violence. I just want you to think about history for a second. What were you taught in school about the founding of this country? What about Christopher Columbus? What were you taught? When you search in the pinpoint clip art for history, the picture that you see on the slide pops up. But how realistic is that picture? The history of an oppressed people is hidden in the lies and the agreed myth of its conquerors. Columbus didn't discover America. There were already people living here. Native people were raped, driven west, taken from their homes, and massacred. Their culture was destroyed. And Columbus Day is still a national holiday, celebrated today because he founded the country. Also, Africans were enslaved and forced from their homelands by the millions to serve as the backbone of an economy based on enslavement and forced labor. Black women were routinely raped by white slave owners, and it wasn't a crime. It was typically expected. When it comes to the real true facts of history, a real history is usually one that contains colonialism, or when a more powerful nation or group of people exploits or dominates the resources of a weaker people or nation in order to strengthen or enrich the stronger group or nation. It also includes genocide and oppression. The European Americans forced the Native Americans out of their lands and murdered them, and Native women were captured and raped. It also includes sexual violence and slavery. African Americans were captured and brought forcibly to the United States to serve as slaves and do forced labor. Again, the black women were regularly raped by their white slave owners. The oppressors will always have the best part of the story. Make history make them sound good. To free ourselves from oppression, we must tell our history from our own viewpoints and not let others tell it anymore. An African proverb that kind of says this is, "Until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt shall always glorify the hunter." So how does mythology play a role in oppression and sexual violence? Well, what is a myth? It's usually a traditional story of seemingly historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. Think about Greek mythology, how they explain tornadoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, and hurricanes. We call those myths today. A popular belief or tradition that has grown up around something or someone, especially one embodying the ideals and institutions of a society or segment of society. Again, think about the Greek mythology. Victims of sexual violence experience something we call victim blaming. This is when the victim is literally blamed for being sexually assaulted. It's kind of similar to how people tell those groups who are oppressed, well, why don't you just leave? Why don't you just tell them to stop? Why don't you just get over it? A really negative thing a lot of people will say, well, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get over it. Forget about it. And when people are victim blamed, they're told, well, why didn't you scream? Well, why didn't you try harder to stop them? Well, it's your fault. Sexual violence and oppression thrive when their victims are silenced. We support the continuation of oppression and sexual violence through ignorance, minimalization, and denial. We tolerate racist, sexist, ageist, oppressive jokes. They make fun of certain people because of certain things about them. We do not address racism or heterosexualism in our agencies at all. We accept how the media portrays people in sexual violence without a second glance or question anything. Oppression also exists within the sexual violent movement. Oppression operates in social justice movements too, not just in general society. The sexual violence movement has historically been, and still is, a white women's movement. The work of women of other races is typically overlooked or forgotten. The work of the anti-rape movement has largely benefited white, heterosexual, able-bodied victims. Oppression exists within the anti-rape movement as a microorganism of the larger culture. Just because we are fighting against injustices doesn't mean oppression is non-existent in this movement. The work of the anti-rape movement has largely benefited white victims. Models have been created that benefit white women, and they focus on the criminal justice system. LGBTQ victim assistance is lacking. History still has an impact on people present day. This is what we call historical trauma. And this is the collective emotional and psychological injury both over the lifespan and across generations resulting from the cataclysmic history of genocide. Even though we may not be directly responsible for what happened in the past, we have a responsibility to acknowledge it and help the victims and survivors acknowledge it themselves and work through it. If you want to work towards ending sexual violence, you have to work towards ending all forms of oppression. When trauma from history is still impacting people today, We call it multi-generational trauma. This occurs when trauma is not resolved, sequentially internalized, and passed from one generation to the next. Sadly, in our area here up in Bemidji, we tend to see it with Native Americans who have family members that were sent to Native American boarding schools, aka Indian residential schools. The children that were sent there experienced horrible abuse and trauma, which then carried through their children and their grandchildren, and so on and so forth. The boarding schools aren't the only events that were traumatic and imposed on Native Americans that have created trauma. There was also warfare, the forceful relocation and removal from their sacred lands. There was the reservation confinement. There was huge genocide. There was the cultural oppression and cultural genocide. Again, there were the boarding schools, which forced assimilation. There was termination. And there is continued ongoing treaty violation even to this day. So what is assimilation? It's a process by which an individual or group is absorbed into another group or culture. Permanent changes to values, beliefs, and cultural identity happen. This happened in the boarding schools when the children were forced to wear European-style clothing, cut and style their hair different, not speak their native language, not practice their beliefs. When a certain group experiences trauma, that group will show symptoms of trauma. So people in that group tend to have a higher suicide rate, as well as a higher mortality rate. Alcoholism and substance abuse rates will also be higher as well. There'll be more domestic violence and child abuse, and typically, low self-esteem is major. Individual symptoms of trauma include anxiety or stress-related illnesses, anger or shame, fear and disgust for others or themselves, isolation from others, even loved ones and friends, and discomfort around the oppressor or the abuser, or events that are reminders of the abuse. What populations experience multi-generational or historical trauma and grief? As we've spoken about, the indigenous people of North America, which includes the First Nations peoples of Canada, American Indian peoples of the United States, Alaska Native peoples, and Native Hawaiians. There's also Holocaust survivors and their family. Children of Nazis or other tyrants have to deal with what their parents did. Any war veteran and their family have to deal with what the family members saw, experienced, did. Survivors and families of Japanese internees. And also, the Hiroshima-Nagasaki survivors and their families have to deal with the bombs that were released on them in World War II. More populations that experience multi-generational and historical trauma are Latino or Hispanic immigrants, Irish and Irish American families, Chinese immigrants and descendants of survivors of World War II, Cultural Revolution, and other wars related, Korean immigrants, anyone living in families at one time marked by severe levels of trauma, poverty, dislocation, war, or anything like that, and who are still suffering as a result. African American descendants of former slaves also experience multi-generational and historical trauma. So why do advocates even need to know this? Well, the relevance of past to current oppression conditions is huge when working with victims. A sexual assault victim might also have experienced multiple other oppressions throughout their life. Also, unlearning the myths and a version of history told by a targeted group, you don't want to know the false history. You want to know what really happened. And it also helps in understand why some survivors may not be happy about an advocate meeting them. They may be uncomfortable with a certain gender, race, religion, belief group. And it can also help understand why some survivors may not want to report to the police or visit medical facilities or utilize any services at all. Dismantling sexual violence and oppression. To be truly victim-centered, we must ally against oppression. We have to dismantle sexual violence, and we must dismantle all forms of oppression as well. The reality of sexual violence includes the reality of colonialism, slavery, racism, classism, ableism. Sexual violence is included in the roots of many, many parts of history. We must reflect the reality of all women's experience, regardless of history, general news media, or just general myths.